Okay, so like imagine this. You're hanging out at home, just a casual night with some friends, and suddenly your neighbor starts like throwing rocks at your house.
Oh, wow.
And then it gets crazier. He like breaks in and attacks your dad, knocks him unconscious.
That's terrifying.
Right, it's a total nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
And this actually happened in the Philippines. And get this, it ended up as a Supreme Court case.
Seriously?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really makes you think about like, where's the line with self-defense?
Yeah.
How far can you go to protect yourself and your family?
I can see how that would raise some tough legal questions.
Totally. So we're diving deep into this case today. It's officially GR No 248130. And the Supreme Court decided on it back on December 2nd, 2020.
Okay, so 2020.
Pretty recent, right? And at the center of it all is this guy, Prudencio Ganal Jr. He's the one who found himself in that crazy situation I was just describing.
So, like, what exactly went down?
All right, so to get the full picture, we got to rewind back to May 20th, 2013.
Okay, so like 8 years before the Supreme Court ruling.
Exactly. It was just a normal night, in this small town in the Philippines. Ganal is just hanging out with friends when his neighbor, this guy named Angelo Falante, shows up uninvited.
Oh, no. That's never a good sign.
And to make things worse, Angelo's already drunk.
Oh, boy.
So you can probably guess what happens next.
Yeah, an argument.
Bingo. They get into a big fight. Angelo eventually leaves, but that's just the start of the trouble.
Uh-oh.
And this is where things escalate. Like really quickly, Angelo starts going nuts. He's throwing rocks at the house.
Jeez, what a jerk.
I know, right? So Ganal's dad hears all this commotion and goes outside to confront Angelo. And to make matters even worse, Angelo's uncle, Julwin Alvarez, shows up too.
2 against 1. It's not fair.
Not at all. They basically force their way through the gate, and Julwin straight up attacks Ganal's dad. He punches him, knocks him out cold.
Wow, so Ganal's dad is unconscious?
Yeah, it was brutal. And here's where things get a little fuzzy. The details leading up to the actual shooting are kind of murky.
Yeah.
Well, the prosecution and the defense, they presented different stories about exactly what happened right before the shooting.
So conflicting accounts.
Exactly. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to the case. But anyway, back to the story. So Ganal Jr., he sees his dad getting attacked, right?
Yeah.
And he reacts instinctively. He grabs his gun and fires a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off Angelo and Julwin.
Makes sense, a warning shot.
But here's the thing. Julwin doesn't back down. He just keeps coming at Ganal Jr.
Oh, wow. So he ignores the warning shot.
Completely.
Yeah.
He's like armed with rocks, even threatening Ganal Jr. and his family. So Ganal Jr., he's in this terrifying situation, right? He's scared for his life, for his family's safety. And he makes a split-second decision. He shoots Julwin.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's tragic. He hits him once and then fires all the remaining bullets in his gun.
So multiple shots.
Yeah. Sadly, Julwin dies from the gunshots and Ganal Jr. is charged with homicide.
So now he's facing a murder charge.
Right. His whole defense hinges on the argument that he was acting in self-defense, protecting himself and his father.
It sounds like a classic self-defense case, but obviously there's more to it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that's where the legal battle really gets going. So the trial court, they look at all the evidence, they listen to both sides, and in the end, they decide to convict Ganal Jr. of homicide.
So they didn't buy the self-defense argument?
Not completely. Their reasoning was that the force he used firing multiple shots was excessive. Like, it went beyond what was really necessary for self-defense.
Okay, I can kind of see that.
Right. But here's the thing. The court did acknowledge that there were some things in Ganal Jr.'s favor. They called them mitigating factors.
Mitigating factors, what are those?
It basically means they recognize he wasn't acting out of pure malice. He was under extreme emotional distress and fear. And he also turned himself in to the police right after the shooting.
So, like, he didn't run away?
Nope, he surrendered voluntarily, which the court saw as a sign of remorse.
That makes sense.
But even with those mitigating factors, a conviction is still a conviction, right? So Ganal Jr. decides he's not giving up. He appeals the decision, takes his case to the Court of Appeals, hoping they'd see things differently.
I see. So he's fighting for his freedom.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He believes he was wrongly convicted, and he's hoping the higher court will overturn the decision.
I can only imagine how stressful that whole process must be.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But unfortunately for Ganal Jr., the Court of Appeals, they uphold the trial court's ruling.
Oh, no. So they agree that the force was excessive and self-defense wasn't fully justified.
Yep. It seems like Ganal Jr. is running out of options.
It does. But wait, didn't you say this went all the way to the Supreme Court?
I did. And that's where things get really interesting.
I'm all ears.
So Ganal Jr., he's determined to clear his name, and he takes his case all the way to the top the Supreme Court of the Philippines.
Wow. So this small town case ends up in the highest court of the land.
Exactly. And that's where the story takes a fascinating turn. You see, the Supreme Court, they had to grapple with this huge question. Was Ganal Jr.'s use of deadly force, even though it resulted in someone's death, legally justifiable under the circumstances? That's a tough one.
Yeah. And to answer that question, they had to dive deep into the whole concept of self-defense, according to Philippine law.
Oh, so they had to look at the legal principles behind self-defense.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so compelling. It's not just about the specific facts of what happened that night. It's about understanding the law itself and how it applies to real-life situations that are messy and chaotic and full of fear and adrenaline.
It sounds like this case could have some major implications for how self-defense is interpreted in the Philippines.
Oh, absolutely. This decision could set a precedent for future cases. So we're going to break down all the legal arguments and the Supreme Court's reasoning in this deep dive.
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right, so let's start with the basics. What does the law actually say about self-defense?
Well, in Philippine law, to claim self-defense successfully, you need to meet certain criteria.
Like what?
There are 3 key elements. The first one is unlawful aggression.
Unlawful aggression, meaning. Basically, it means the person who ended up being harmed had to be the one who started the aggression. They had to be the attacker.
So in this case, would Julwin's actions be considered unlawful aggression?
That's what the court had to decide. Remember, he forced his way onto the property, he assaulted Ganal's dad, and he continued to advance towards Ganal Jr. even after the warning shot.
Right. So there's definitely an argument to be made there.
For sure. Okay, so that's the first element, unlawful aggression. The second one is reasonable necessity of the means employed.
Reasonable necessity. Okay, break that down for me.
Basically, this means that the actions taken in self-defense have to be reasonably necessary to stop the attack.
So like if someone pushes you and you pull out a gun and shoot them, that's probably not going to fly.
Right, exactly. The force used has to be proportionate to the threat.
So in Ganal Jr.'s case, the court had to decide if shooting Julwin multiple times was truly necessary to protect himself and his family.
Right, and that's where things get tricky, because it's not always easy to judge what's reasonably necessary in the heat of the moment.
Especially when you're terrified and your adrenaline is pumping.
Exactly. The court had to consider the context, the intensity of the situation, and the fact that Ganal Jr. was acting under extreme stress.
And the third element.
The third element is lack of sufficient provocation.
So basically, you can't start a fight and then claim self-defense when the other person fights back.
Exactly.
You can't be the instigator.
So the court had to determine if Ganal Jr. provoked the attack in any way.
Right. They had to look at the evidence and decide who was really the aggressor in this whole situation.
This is getting complicated.
It is. There's a lot to unpack here. And what makes this case even more fascinating is how the Supreme Court approached their decision.
How so?
Well, they didn't just focus on the cold, hard facts and the legal technicalities. They also considered the human element. You know, the psychology of someone facing a violent threat.
So they took into account the fear, the adrenaline, the split-second decision-making that happens in those life or death situations. Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore next. How did the Supreme Court weigh all these factors, and what did they ultimately decide?
We'll find out in part 2 of our deep dives, so stay tuned. Okay, so last time we were talking about this crazy case in the Philippines, right, where this guy, Ganal Jr., shot and killed his neighbor, Julwin, after Julwin attacked his dad.
Yeah, it's a wild story, and the Supreme Court actually had to step in to decide if the shooting was justified as self-defense.
Exactly. And remember, Ganal Jr., he was convicted by the lower courts,
Yeah.
but he appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Right. So, like, what did the Supreme Court decide?
All right, so get this. The Supreme Court, they made a pretty surprising decision. They acquitted Ganal Jr.
Whoa. So they completely overturned the lower court's rulings.
Yep. They said he was acting in lawful self-defense.
Wow. That's a huge reversal. So, like, what specifically led them to that conclusion?
Well, they basically went through each element of self-defense super carefully. Remember we talked about the 3 elements last time?
Yeah. Unlawful aggression, reasonable necessity, and lack of provocation.
Right. So starting with unlawful aggression, the Supreme Court, they agreed that Julwin's actions totally qualified.
Makes sense. He did attack Ganal's dad and everything.
Exactly. They pointed out how Julwin, forcefully entered the property, brutally attacked Ganal's dad. And he kept coming at Ganal Jr. even after that warning shot.
So the court was saying the threat to Ganal Jr. and his family was real and immediate.
Exactly. They were in danger.
Okay, but what about the whole excessive force thing?
Right. The lower court said that Ganal Jr. using his gun and firing multiple shots was excessive.
Yeah. How did the Supreme Court deal with that?
Well, this is where their reasoning gets really interesting. They acknowledged that Ganal Jr. did fire multiple shots, but they didn't think that automatically meant it wasn't self-defense.
So, like, they took the context into account.
Exactly. They emphasized how intense that situation was.
Hmm.
Ganal Jr. was facing this guy who had already proven he was violent.
And he was still armed even after the warning shot.
Right. The court was basically saying you can't expect someone in that position to react perfectly.
Like, they don't have time to think it through calmly.
Exactly. And they even cited another case where they said someone being attacked can't be expected to carefully choose their method of defense. They're reacting to a threat.
That makes sense. It's a fight or flight response.
Totally. So the Supreme Court, they were really looking at the human element here.
Yeah.
The psychology of someone facing a life or death situation.
So they're saying the law has to take into account those real-life factors.
Right. They even use this phrase, rational necessity. Like you need to act rationally given the circumstances, but you don't have to be perfect.
Okay, I'm following. So they covered unlawful aggression and reasonable necessity. What about that third element, lack of sufficient provocation?
Yeah. The Supreme Court, they found that was present too.
Mm.
Basically, all the evidence showed that Julwin was the one who started everything. He was the aggressor.
So Ganal Jr. didn't provoke him or anything?
Nope, it was all Julwin.
So in the end, the Supreme Court said Ganal Jr. was justified in using deadly force to protect himself and his family.
Yeah. It was a tough situation, obviously, with a tragic outcome, but they ruled that his actions fell under the legal definition of self-defense.
It really makes you think about, like, what any of us would do in a situation like that.
It does. The fear, the adrenaline, the split-second decisions, it's hard to say how you'd react unless you've been there.
Right. And I think what's so important about this case is that the Supreme Court, they didn't just look at the law in a vacuum. They considered the human side of things.
Totally.
Yeah.
They were thinking about Ganal Jr.'s state of mind in that moment.
Yeah. And I think that's really crucial because the law needs to be applied to real people, with all their emotions and instincts and imperfections.
Absolutely. It can't just be about cold, hard rules.
Mm.
It has to take into account the realities of human behavior.
Right. And I think this case does a good job of highlighting that balance, between the need for personal safety and the potential consequences of using deadly force.
It's a tough balance, for sure. And this case has definitely set a precedent for how self-defense is going to be interpreted in the Philippines moving forward.
For sure. So we've covered a lot of ground here, but there's still more to explore.
Yeah. We need to talk about the bigger implications of this case and what it means for the future of self-defense law.
Exactly. There's so much to unpack. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've been talking about this intense Supreme Court case, GR No. 248130, you remember, where Prudencio Ganal Jr. was found not guilty of homicide because he acted in self-defense.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how far you can go to protect yourself, especially when someone's life is on the line.
Totally, and it raises all these questions about, like, where's the line between defending yourself and using too much force?
For sure.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting about this case is that it's not just about one guy and what happened that night.
Right. It has implications for everyone in the Philippines because the Supreme Court's decision, it sets a precedent for how self-defense is going to be interpreted in future cases.
Exactly. So we've talked about the specifics of Ganal Jr.'s case, but, what's the bigger picture here? What does this ruling mean for everyone else?
Okay, so basically this case gives us some really important guidelines for how courts should look at self-defense, especially in situations where the threat is right there in your face and super overwhelming.
Right, like in Ganal Jr.'s case where the guy was attacking his dad and then coming after him with rocks.
Exactly. The Supreme Court made it clear that you can't expect someone in that kind of situation to react perfectly.
Yeah. You can't expect them to stop and think, okay, what's the absolute minimum force I can use here?
Right. They're operating on instinct.
Yeah.
Adrenaline's pumping, fear's taking over.
Huh.
And the court recognized that.
They did. They even used that phrase, rational necessity, remember?
Yeah. You have to act rationally given the circumstances.
Yeah.
But you don't have to be a robot.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important distinction because it acknowledges the human element in these situations.
Totally. It's like the court is saying, we get it. You're not going to make perfect decisions when you're fighting for your life.
Right. You're not thinking about the law.
Yeah.
You're just trying to survive.
And the court also emphasized the importance of understanding the person's state of mind.
Yeah, were they genuinely afraid? Were they acting out of panic?
Exactly, because that context is super important when you're judging whether their actions were justified.
Absolutely. And this case also brings up another really important issue:
What's that?
gun ownership.
Ah, yeah, that's a big one.
The court upheld Ganal Jr.'s right to defend himself, but it also kind of implicitly raises the question of when is it really okay to use deadly force?
Right. When does protection become something else?
It's a question everyone who owns a gun has to wrestle with.
And it's a question society as a whole needs to talk about, too.
Yeah.
What are the limits of self-defense? What are the responsibilities that come with owning a firearm?
For sure. This case is a stark reminder that using a gun should always be the absolute last resort.
It's not something to take lightly. Obviously, the consequences can be huge.
Absolutely. So yeah, this deep dive, it's been heavy, but I think it's been really important.
I agree. It's given us a lot to think about, and I hope it's helped our listeners understand the complexities of self-defense law a little better.
Me too. Because ultimately, this case, it affects all of us.
Exactly. You never know when you might find yourself in a situation where you need to protect yourself or your loved ones.
And understanding your rights and the limits of those rights is crucial.
It could even save your life.
So as you go about your day, think about this. How do you define self-defense? What are your boundaries? And what would you do if you were faced with a situation where you felt like your life was in danger?
Those are some tough questions to ponder. But they're important ones. And if you found this case as fascinating as we did, let us know. Leave a comment. Hit that favorite button and subscribe for more thought-provoking deep dives. We'll see you next time.